here we are. We are into debate week and up to our necks in that. And typically we would be talking about that on the WRIT Race. John Wright here with us as usual. And we're happy to welcome in Laura Babcock from Power Group. Good morning, Laura. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Thanks for including me in the program.
Well, it's going to be important to kind of get your insights on this because I think, we booked you a few days back, but it really is coming down to a conversation about what is being messaged and what is being really focused on in the media. Let's just kind of pull one out of the hat here and just start with the whole gun debate. And I was on the air this weekend on the radio talking about it. And my own sense of this has been for a long time that it is a dishonest discussion. It's a dishonest debate because we are talking about completely different things as soon as we start to talk about what qualifies as a banned weapon. And to make it more complicated, I think the media is generally lazy on this file. They do not understand what they're talking about, so they can't ask the right question.
I would agree. And I think that it's not going to be the defining issue of this race, this election, even the debates. While it might have scored well for Trudeau, they made a couple points coming out of the French debate in Quebec. Most Canadians don't own guns, or if they do, they understand the issue better than the media does. It's a nuanced issue, which makes it very difficult to try to get into a really strong ad or into a really good talking point. I think what's much more defining coming out of the all-important Labor Day is people are waking up to this election. They are getting their kids back to school, and they are saying, what the hell is going on that campaign trail? Rocks are being thrown at our prime minister. I mean, it made international headlines this morning. And so people are going to look at that and go, what's going on? And they just may look at it and say, if it's not happening to O'Toole, then perhaps it's coming from O'Toole's side. And they will get frustrated and think, is this an attack on our democracy? Trudeau this morning messaged that it's in line with what happened on January 6th in the US, which is our living nightmare up in Canada, to have that kind of violence and partisanship. And people may just say, listen, I thought I liked O'Toole. I thought I was getting sick of Trudeau, and I'm a little PO'd about this election timing. But rocks at the prime minister, this is where it's heading? I don't think so. And Trudeau was clever today to say Canadians have a basic sense of decency. And when he brings out that Canadiana brand that has worked well for the Trudeaus for a very long time, being attacked is a good sympathy vote. So I think this might be the September surprise, gentlemen, since this election will be settled before the October surprise can come.
So do we risk, though, sort of turning up the heat on an issue that can get out of control? We're talking about, to use the Trudeau's own words, it's a fringe group out there. And all of that rhetoric that he's using, sort of hinting that it's, those fringe conservatives and it's the Maxime Berniers of the world and they should be dismissed and they're all crazy and so on. He's turning up the heat on this. And if the best way to get somebody to sort of get in your face is the way he did.
My thought on this is it is already turned up. I was able to be moderating a anti-hate conference with international experts, including from the Southern Poverty Law Center and others. And they have dealt with this issue escalating in the US. They warned back in May that hate groups are organizing in Canada. In fact, the quote, gentlemen, that I think I'll always take away is, where there is fear, hate organizes. There's tremendous fear of another lockdown. There's tremendous fear of the vaccination passports among some groups. And there's some fear about more Trudeau government. And so you mix all that fear, you whip it all up, and you start to get these outrageous acts. Now, gravel's not as big of a deal as storming the Capitol building, right? And trying to kidnap people. But it is still more than Canadians are willing to accept on the election trail. We don't want this kind of politic in Canada. And so I think no matter what Trudeau says, if he says that it's no big deal, people will say, well, if it were Black or Indigenous protesters who did it, it would be a big deal. So are you then, preferring them because they were probably white people? So he can't go there. And if he acts as though it's the hugest deal in the world, people will say, well, come on, what about Shawinigan handshake? And what about everything that went on with Chrétien? You can't handle a little gravel. So he has to just say what I think he did cleverly today, which is, it's unacceptable. We don't want that kind of escalation in this country. So I don't think Trudeau is at risk of escalating it, Dave. I think that it's already there. And what he needs to do is look like his character in the crisis.
Well, I think, John, they've all got to share that banner, don't they? And I mean, kind of, it would be better to say, reach out to O'Toole, reach out to Singh, and say, we should all agree that this is unacceptable. Have almost a joint statement and put it behind you and move on. Otherwise, to your point, it's a boiling cauldron here.
It's not going to work. Let me give you a slightly different perspective that I came to understand this weekend, because I too saw the bus and I saw the gravel thrown, the pebbles, whatever you want to call it. But I looked very carefully, and in the crowd there were T-shirts and there were people with placards, and it's the PPC. They're not conservatives. It's the PPC. And we have gone from almost 1% supporting the PPC last election to about 6 to 8% right now. And it's I'm looking at my data tables. It's gone up, 2%, 4%, 6%. We're getting up there, and it's in all the. So then I started to listen to Maxime Bernier and the people that he was getting around. So picture this. Picture 1,000 people in Manitoba, not dressed as skinheads or outrageous people, but families with kids and T-shirts. And Oshawa the same way, and London the same way, hot dogs, but signs and these T-shirts, and him standing in front of them and saying the following: when tyranny becomes law, revolution becomes our duty, and all of them cheer. So let me put this to you slightly differently. We have an election right now that is providing a combustible opportunity for a bunch of people to come together. We also have a pandemic which has disenfranchised about 14 to 16% of the population. These people who say they are not going to get vaccinated are now being shut out. They're being shut out because this passport says you can't go to a restaurant, you can't even have a job. And they're feeling as if they don't have any rights whatsoever. They feel that this is in the what he's talking about is tyranny and liberty. You then have a vessel called the PPC, and you're starting to see that coalesce around there, and they're angry. I don't know what the solution to this is, but when you have 4.4 million people in this country who are suddenly excluded from your society, to which I think the media doesn't cover them very much, and especially 50,000 people in Montreal would have been a big thing, but it's not, or even protests in downtown Toronto, you just don't get any coverage. And it might be, well, if we do it, then we'll encourage them. Then it feeds on another conspiracy, and that is fake news. They don't report us. They're not giving us voice. So when I looked at the front of the bus and I saw that guy giving Trudeau the finger, I saw behind him, and it's not the Conservatives. And I think that with Trudeau standing up and saying, we have no place in society for this sort of stuff, he's mirroring what they're saying, and that is, you don't have any place in society for me. Where are my rights? What do I have to do? I think this election is not being covered in a particular way, and it's going to provide a societal collision that we've never seen. Well, maybe the last time we saw it was in the 1960s, the late 1960s, because the language is being used here for families who feel ostracized, for people without, their liberty, and there's all kinds of things in this. They're all coming together. And I think that that's the output of this, where you're not seeing the Conservatives move very much, or the Liberals. You're seeing, we're looking at the election in a very traditional way, and yet over here is another party that's growing, to 8%, and it's attracting a lot of people and momentum, and it's angry. And we're not even focused on that. We're giving it another name. It's another party doing it. So John,
I don't disagree with the thing you've said in terms of the threatening rise of the PPC. I've been in protest against them when some of their members were at Hamilton City Hall, right? And there was some dangerous white supremacist groups mixed in, and it was a motley crew of trouble. So I'm not in any way saying Canadians shouldn't be on high alert to the PPC, to their rhetoric, to the anger, disenfranchisement. I mean, we only have to look at what was happening in the U.S. the last 5 years to see where this ends up. Having said that, in terms of the actual, what happens in terms of seats that are accrued in this election, who's going to get over the finish line with a minority or majority, I don't think it's going to play a sufficient factor. From a messaging point of view, Canadians are just coming into this. And do they have the nuance that you have to say, in that crowd against Trudeau, I saw people from this small, fledgling, angry party? Or are they going to say, well, if O'Toole's not getting rocks thrown at him, then it must be the opposition to Trudeau. And they will lump O'Toole into that. We've already seen Jagmeet come out this afternoon on Twitter and totally disavow what happened. And he's already done that line about, I stand against this. So what is not good news for O'Toole is if Canadians look at this guy and say, wait, is he part of that fringe? And if he is, no thanks. That's too big of a risk.
Well, I mean, this morning, his news conference, that was the first question out for O'Toole. And I thought he was unequivocal about it. There's no room for any kind of that violence or harassment, never mind throwing rocks at anybody on any campaign. I guess to John's point, though, Laura, we can look at this as a race between now and September the 20th. My worry is that this is just the beginning of something that is going to, be an albatross around the neck of whoever forms the next government, and is really going to challenge the governing in the next 2 to 5, 6, 10 years.
It's terrifying. And just if I can say back to that anti-hate conference, it was a 2-day conference. And all we heard over and over from Canadian experts was that Canada has not even neared its risk, its level. It has not tipped back, right? We are escalating. And we are seeing in this election, to be able to be so angry as to protest outside of a hospital to block cancer patients from getting their treatment is a level of off the charts anger and inhumanity, because what all the factors John cited are pushing people to this place where they feel as though they have to revolt. They feel as though they are not being heard. We have seen news reporters. I used to be a television journalist. I've covered pickets and protests. I have never had anyone try to hit me, say they wish that I was raped, as happened to a CH reporter yesterday. I've never had dead rats put outside my news van. I mean, what we are seeing, we should all be terrified of. And the question becomes, who can lead us through what is going to be a very dark decade? I mean, we're still in a pandemic. People have taken incredible mental health and business losses and economic losses and social losses. I mean, we are going to be rebuilding from this for a long time, no matter what promises are made to us by political leaders. I think Canadians are looking at this and saying, our society, the loss of our democracy, put that with climate change, put that with the pandemic, it's a pretty rough time. So who can best lead us through this? And I think that will unconsciously be the ballot choice when everyone walks into the booth, not the campaign rhetorics or the promise of balancing the budget in 10 years with no cuts or whatever any of them put out. It's going to be, I don't like where Canada's going. Who is going to get us back to where I want it to be? It might be O'Toole, it might be Trudeau, it might be Singh. I don't think it's going to be Bernier at this stage, but I would be very worried in 4 years how much momentum his party is going to be able to accrue.
And on that, I'm also working on a podcast with the folks at the Daily Bread Food Bank. It's called the 2030 Project. And essentially, we dig in on how do we reduce poverty in this country. And the cost of poverty is $30 billion a year in Ontario alone. So this is highly significant. Neil Hetherington leads the Daily Bread Food Bank, and he will tell you almost just what you just said, Laura, that we're on this uprise, and and I have used that word in 2 ways, I guess, where we're seeing the numbers increase in terms of this anger and the anxiety on the one hand. The other part of it is, he says, it's going to be 2, maybe 3 years before we peak in terms of the stress on our social services, on food banks, et cetera. And he points back to 08, 09, the financial crisis in that era, and we're still feeling the effects of that. So, I begin to wonder then, to both of you, whether or not the answer is what the answer was on day one of this campaign, and to focus on what matters to Canadians. And in all cases, what we're touching on here is the affordability of living in this country. So if I'm going to am I losing my job? Am I able to get to where I want to go? Do I have so all of these things that I used to have in the before times? It does come down to those questions of accessibility and affordability. If they can manage that, maybe it takes some of the sting out of this, but I don't know.
Also, from a business consulting point of view, and I used to manage a chamber of commerce, one of the things that alleviates that stress for small business is consistency, right? Mm-hmm. And to see chaos is antithetical to the idea of security financially. So while I do agree that messages around affordability, and certainly the NDP are pushing this heavily, messages around the national housing strategy, pharmacare, all these things that will help take some of the pressure off living in this country, from a lot of people going to the booths, I think they're going to look at it and say, listen, there's so much I can't predict. I sit with companies all the time doing strategic plans. They can't budget more than in 3-6 month cycles. They have no idea. All of their past budgeting means very little after the pandemic, right? How do you predict the future when we are still looking at a fourth wave and triple vaccinations and all the rest? So I think what people are going to kind of feel, and to me, messaging is often an expression of feeling. People are going to feel tremendous stress. And the leader that can show stability and authority and compassion on those issues, but generally is, I think, the one that Canadians are going to want to vote for. And I've been impressed at O'Toole's ability to communicate. He really has been better than I thought initially. The campaign's been a little tighter than we've seen. Certainly, he has more charisma than Scheer. He may be the person who represents what that is for Canadians. We'll find out. But I think it's really going to come down to that gut check of who makes me feel safe, because I don't feel safe. This is not something about politics. This is not partisan anymore. This is, am I going to have a job? Am I going to be able to afford a house? Can I afford food prices that are escalating? Who is going to represent safety? And chaos does not create a value proposition for security.
But it also makes people look at the current governing structure and the current leader of the country and say, I don't want this because he does that. I mean, we have a prime minister in this country who, when we've got 5 churches that burn down and the RCMP doesn't have a lead or anybody arrested, says, I can understand that. Rather than, we won't tolerate that. We have a prime minister in this country that really doesn't talk to the fact that people are pulling down statues across the country, and no one's really getting arrested for that too. So it's actually giving license to potential violence because there's no consequence to it. So I agree with you, Laura, that this becomes a crucial part in the last 2 weeks of the campaign, and it's shaping up into some place that I don't even think that the Prime Minister felt it would end up here, because I think it has the potential for militancy. It really does. But it's something that is burbling out there. And by saying, we don't want this, is actually saying to those people, we don't want you. And the fact that we're still almost, 32, 33% in the vote for the 2 major parties, and behind them is Mr. Singh coming up in the 20s, there's no majority in this country thinking this. It's just sliced into groups. I think it's going to come down to who gets out and votes. And so it may be for Mr. Trudeau's benefit that he stokes the fires, which unfortunately stoke the people on the outside, but it gets his base, up to snuff so they can go out and actually will vote. And that's
the liberals were
completely.
Apathetic. I just finished a cross-country tour. I went to every single province, west of Ontario, spoke to people everywhere. And I heard from farmers. One guy said that terrible drought, worst I've seen in my entire life. But damn Trudeau and his climate tax, right? Or they don't like him, but they don't like what's happening with climate change. And some people I met in Alberta were like, how could he hold an election when there are fires in BC and my family is there? So there are people who are angry at Trudeau on a whole host of issues. I do think this is a gift to him in the sense that Canadians will look at this and say, on top of all the other stress in my life, I can't handle this kind of politics I'm seeing in the States. And there's a rally being planned right before our election in the US to defend the people from the January 6th, treasonous attack that's going to play to Trudeau. So Trudeau may be at a point where he's pivoting with his team to say, go tough on the people who are causing chaos. It might disenfranchise more people, but it might just get us over the line. And unfortunately, politics at this level is pretty crass. That may stoke more anger and disenfranchise more people, but they're probably looking at a win strategy at this stage.
Yeah.
So I've got a few minutes here, and I know you have a hard stop for us today, John. So I don't want to cramp this too much, but we're going into debates now, and normally we would have been talking issues. How do they, Laura, navigate debate preparation against this backdrop?
Well, I think John hit it on the head. I mean, when Trudeau starts to get tougher in his talk, some people who might have been looking at O'Toole but are just looking for that kind of strength because they're feeling like it's turning into the 1960s again, and everything is looking incredibly fragile. If Trudeau comes out as strong as he did in the Quebec debate and takes it right to O'Toole, stands against anti-vaxxers. I mean, look at the population. We are one of the top vaccinated populations in the world by capita, right? So when he comes out against virulent anti-vaxxers who are standing out in front of hospitals, he looks like he's on the side of what most people feel. And so I do think this is going to become about emotion. It's going to be about the drama of the moment. And Trudeau, that plays to his strengths in a debate. O'Toole has an opportunity, of course. He's, as I said, performs better than an Andrew Scheer. I wouldn't want to be Scheer standing on the stage with this kind of drama and this kind of energy. I think O'Toole better meets that. He better meets that moment. But Trudeau can walk into these debates and say, I stand for Canada, Canadian values, for safety and democracy, and I stand against these people who are basically coming at his campaign. So it makes him look like he is the hero to the enemy. It's a good narrative for him coming into these debates. Doesn't mean he's going to win, but it's a good place to be walking into.
Yeah, there's two parts to the debates that can change that completely for Trudeau to own all of that. Number one is the debate format in English Canada is just a circus. I mean, you've got all kinds of reporters, with all kinds of their own personal agendas as well to ask a whole bunch of different questions rather than the Quebec one, which was very straightforward, with one moderator doing what they were doing. So, I mean, the debate format over the next period of time is going to give rise to different approaches. Number two, Mr. O'Toole has demonstrated the capacity throughout this campaign that every time the Liberals have thrown something up in the air on a policy to say, yeah, well, me too. You condemn, I do too. You want guns out? Well, so do I. I'll put a footnote on my platform. I mean, he's done this too. I mean, you've got O'Toole, who, if you say was more reasonable than maybe Mr. Trudeau is, and you're sitting there and going, well, I didn't like Mr. Trudeau. You might also say, he might say, look, I was in the military. I know what these things are like. I know how they go. I've been in peacekeeping situations, all that sort of stuff. I don't count anybody out. So, Laura, you and I are on the same page. Yeah, and I do give an edge.
For sure.
I give Mr. Trudeau the edge right now because he's the one having rocks thrown at him, not the other people. So, buckle up. It's going to be a pretty wicked ride.
If I could add one last note to that assessment, which I think is great, John, is the fact that you have O'Toole being able to pivot on issues quickly. He's no fool. He's not getting killed on any hill. However, at what point does his fervent base, who had all the momentum coming into this, was his base who wanted to vote Trudeau out, right? That passion. When he turns on guns and flip-flops like he does, when he starts to pivot and sound more like Trudeau, does he lose the very anger that was animating some of his base against the leader they've not liked for the last however many years? Are they going to say, this guy's not strong enough on our platform? He sounds like he's playing too much to Trudeau. So that's a risk for him to alienate his own base as he pivots.
I think he probably has already. And I'm going to postulate this just before the end, and just to think about it. And you got to come back, Laura. This is fantastic. I suggest to you that the people who are joining Max Bernier are coming from other parties. They're not simply coming from conservatives, because you can be a liberal and think, I'm not going to get vaccinated. Like you can. And you show up at work and they go, well, you better do it or you're going to have to pay $400 a week to make sure that you get a job. I mean, you're being put in a dilemma that you might even be an NDP and say, I have the rights to do this. And they go, no, you don't. This is the capitalist society. It's coming down on your head. So I think that part of it is that he's lost that group already. I mean, the militant drive, I'm out there and I hate Trudeau, all that stuff. That's why his numbers are at 32 or 33 and not at 36 and 37. The second thing is, this is across all genders. It's across all regions of the country, all incomes, education. And I think it's across all of the different parties where people are now identifying with a thing that affects them. And they're finding commonality in a group of disparate people they never thought they'd be able to get together, wear T-shirts, and have hot dogs before they go and throw rocks. I mean, that's almost what this is coming down to, I think.
Well, I'll second the motion here, and we'll definitely want to have you back before we start counting the ballots. Thanks for joining us today, Laura. It was good to have you.
My pleasure, guys. Thanks.
Laura Babcock of the Power Group, John Wright, of course, of Maru Public Opinion. I'm Dave Trafford. This is the WRIT Race. It's an Eye Contact podcast.